Thank you, Shaniqua. The other thing is at the end of the program, we will have some time that if you would prefer to unmute your mic and go ahead and ask that question at that time, we'll be happy to do that. So with that, when we think about the components of a herd health program, and for those of you who were on last week when we talked about internal parasite control, you've seen this slide before because there's several components of that herd health program. So we think about having the right nutrition in place. If those animals don't have adequate amounts of protein and energy and then some minerals in the diet, the immune system's just not going to work as well. There's some genetic differences when we think about herd health and we think about immunity. Biosecurity is a big one. So we don't think about it enough in the beef industry is what we probably should. They focus on it extremely hard when we talk about the swine industry or the poultry industry. But where we need to think about it in the beef cattle industry is if you have some excess grass and you chose to go out and buy some starter calves and bring those back, you definitely want to make sure you avoid putting them with your cows because they may have been exposed to something that they can spread to the cows and cause some abortions and those kind of things. So we would definitely want to quarantine them as well as any new breeding stock that you bring in. It's not a bad idea to quarantine them for a while. One that we really think about from a biosecurity standpoint is trick. And when we think about trick, that's a protozoal infection that spread through breeding activity, can cause high rates of abortions. We can commonly see 40 to 60% abortion rate when we're dealing with trick. And so having some good fences to make sure we don't have any unwanted bulls coming across or cows or your cattle going to the neighbor and potentially getting infected and then coming back or infecting the neighbor's cows if yours are infected. So we definitely want to think about that from a biosecurity standpoint. And then when we think about parasite control, we need to make sure we control those external parasites as much as possible, and then make sure we have a good strategic deworming program for those internal parasites. If we don't, our vaccination program is just not going to work as well. So for those of you who participated in a preconditioned calf cell or special calf cell before, you may have noticed in addition to a list of vaccines they give you, you have to deworm those animals. And that's because we know that the animals may not respond as well to vaccine if they have a high internal parasite burden. So when we think about cattle diseases, we can kind of break them into a few different groups. The two main ones are going to be our bacterial diseases and then our viral diseases. We do have some protozoal diseases. One of those I mentioned is trick already. Then fungal diseases, typically not a big deal, but we may see that from time to time in some of the show animals that your kids or grandkids may be involved with. And there's some other ones. But the two groups we're really going to focus on tonight is our bacterial and our viral pathogens. And so just bear with me here for a few minutes on these next couple of slides. I'm going to throw out some names, but I want you to see those. So when you see that vaccine bottle and see those names, you're a little more familiar with them. So the first way I'm going to talk about these is whether these pathogens will cause reproductive loss, and that can be infertility, early embryonic loss, or abortion are the two big ones we think about. But it also could cause some fertility problems as far as actually getting that animal pregnant to begin with. And then we'll talk about some pneumonia or bovine respiratory disease here in a minute. So when we think about the diseases that can cause reproductive loss, and this isn't all of them, but these are going to be some of the most common ones. We'll think about leptohargiobovis, and this is one that gets a little confusing because you'll see it listed a couple different ways. But the way you'll see it on a lot of vaccines and their naming of those products, they'll refer to it as HB. Then we'll have our 5 traditional strains of lepto that you'll see in those products. And there's also a leptohargio in there, but it's not hargiobovis. So we do need to make sure we keep those separate. And with lepto, realize it's transmitted in a lot of different manners. So breeding activity is definitely one, but it can also be carried by wildlife, and we can see it in our water sources. So that's one we all need to be aware of. Campylobacter fetus, or what we'll commonly referred to it as is Vibrio. You'll see on the vaccine bottles. Brucellosis is one that maybe we don't think about as much as we did at one point in time, because Texas is currently classified as brucellosis free. But you still may want to consider vaccinating those replacement heifers, and realize you need to do that between about 4 and 12 months of age. If you're going to look at selling those, especially if you go out of state, there can be some real value in having them vaccinated for brucellosis. And then when we think about viral organisms, IBR is the term we typically use the most. That's describing a disease and technically the respiratory portion of it. But most people use it when we're talking about all aspects of diseases caused by bovine herpes virus 1 is the actual organism, but IBR is what I'll refer to it as throughout most of the presentation tonight. BVD is another viral pathogen that can cause abortions in our females. And then Trick is the protozoa parasite I mentioned before. So when we think about reproductive loss in the cow herd, all these can cause reproductive loss for us. When we think about, you may hear it called shipping fever or pneumonia, or the term I'm going to use tonight is bovine respiratory disease. I'll refer to it as pneumonia as well, but all those respiratory issues that we would lump in there together. Typically, when we think about from a viral standpoint, that's when we talk about IBR, BVD, PI3, and BRSV. So notice on the IBR and BVD, on the cow side, we think about them causing reproductive loss. On the calf side, or the growing animal side, we think about pneumonia and shipping fever. PI3 is another viral organism, as well as BRSV. And then we think about from a bacterial standpoint, so what happens in cattle a lot is they'll get the viral infection to begin with, that weakens the immune system, and then we'll have a bacterial pneumonia come in on top of that in a lot of situations. And then that's when we come back and use those antibiotics to treat that bacterial infection. The antibiotics aren't going to be effective against our viral pathogens, just the bacteria. So Mannheimia hemolytica is a big one. If you're selling in preconditioned calf cells, usually that's one that's going to be required. That used to be known as Pastorella hemolytica. Most of the products have switched over to the Mannheimia hemolytica name, but sometimes you still may see Pastorella hemolytica. Just realize that's the same organism there. They've just changed the name as they've kind of reclassified it. Pastorella metacida is another one we'll see. And then Histophilus somni are what used to be known as Haemophilus somnus. And again, that's another common one for preconditioned calf cells that you may have to vaccinate for. So that's kind of thinking about those pathogens from, do they cause reproductive loss, or do they cause bovine respiratory disease? But now I kind of want to talk about them a little bit more as, are they bacterial, are they viral, and then what do we kind of see combinations when we think about our vaccines out there? So typically I would ask, who vaccinates for Clostridial diseases versus who vaccinates for blackleg, and you'll see different hands go up. What we want to realize is when we talk about blackleg, that's just one component of that Clostridial vaccine that we're talking about. So that 7 or 8 way vaccine, that's a Clostridial vaccine that we'll talk about. Blackleg would be Clostridium shelbyii there. We'll see, you can see the other ones on the screen. I won't read through all of them, but Clostridium perfringens is one we may see at times. Clostridium hemolyticum is the red water. So that's typically the difference we'll see between a 7 or an 8 way. Is the 7 way will have the ones in blue there above. And I realize what's listed on the screen doesn't add up to 7, but because of the way some of the fractions work and stuff, the industry is going to refer to that as a 7 way. The 8 way is going to be the Clostridium hemolyticum there, or otherwise known as red water. If you're worried about liver flukes, that's when we typically think about using that 8 way instead of the 7 way. And then if you're worried about tetanus, most Clostridial vaccines do not contain tetanus, but there are a couple on the market that do. and that would be listed on the label as Clostridium tetani. So remember, the clostridial organisms or that clostridial vaccine is that 7 or 8 way vaccine that most people think about from a blackleg standpoint. It has those other components in there as well. When we think about our reproductive diseases, so Campylobacter fetus, or more commonly known as Vibrio, is going to be one that's a bacterial organism. It's only transmitted through breeding activity. So some people will include that in their operations, some won't, depending on what their risk level is as far as bringing other animals in. Then when we talk about the lepto, like I mentioned before, you have the 5 traditional strains of lepto, and then you have the leptohargiobovis, and then you have brucellosis, and all those can cause reproductive losses. And like I previously mentioned, when we think about the respiratory side from the bacterial diseases specifically, that's the Mannheimia hemolytica, the Pasteurella metoxida, and then the Haemophilus somni. When we think about the viral diseases, and these have longer names, but everybody uses the abbreviation, so that's what I'm going to use tonight. That's what you'll see them listed as most often. So remember, the IBR and BVD can cause both reproductive as well as respiratory issues. And then PI3 and BRSV, we typically think about those from a respiratory standpoint. So what diseases would be routinely vaccinated for in a cow-calf operation specifically? So when we think about calves, we would think about that 7 or 8 way clostridial vaccine. We would think about a viral respiratory vaccine, so the IBR, the BVD, the PI3, and then the BRSV. And then especially if you're in the area of the state, higher rainfall area that typically has more of a problem with lepto, I really like including lepto in that vaccine for calves. While we don't have to worry about reproduction loss in those calves, if calves get lepto, it can kill them. Now, if we catch them early, they will respond to vaccine, but I really like including that in there for our calves. And then also from a long-term reproductive standpoint in those replacement heifers, there can be some value in having that lepto vaccine in those calves. When we think about the replacement heifers and our cow herd, again, we're going to use that 7 or 8 way clostridial vaccine is going to be common. You may say, well, I didn't think cows get blackleg. Well, they may not get blackleg, but they can get some of those other clostridial vaccines. In addition, when we think about those calves being born without any immunity, and their initial immunity comes from the colostrum, if we vaccinate that cow and get her antibodies up for blackleg, she passes those through her colostrum to that calf, and it helps protect that calf early in life. Then we definitely want to make sure we vaccinate those cows for IBR and BVD. Because of the way most of our vaccines are sold these days, in addition to the IBR and BVD, we'll see the PI3 and the BRSV in there, but we're really focused on the IBR and the BVT typically. And then lepto for the reproductive losses we talked about. And then if you are moving some animals in and out, you may want to think about Vibrio. That can cause some reproductive losses. But remember, the Vibrio is only transmitted through breeding activity. So these are kind of the diseases we routinely vaccinate for. It's not an all-inclusive list by any means. And you really want to visit with your cattle veterinarian and make sure that may not be the same person you take your dogs or cats to. Make sure it's a veterinarian who's routinely practicing on cattle, and so they're able to keep up a little bit better with some of the changes we see in the industry. But visit with them about the risk you have in your herds. This would kind of be a basic approach, and then sometimes we may add something to that. But these would be on the list I would think most cow-calf producers need to consider vaccinating for. So when we think about vaccine terminology, I mentioned the 7 or the 8 way clostridial vaccine, and I mentioned previously, but I'll go ahead and mention again, repetition is always good when we're talking about vaccines, is that the difference between that 7 and that 8 way clostridial product is going to be Clostridium hemolyticum, or what's referred to as red water. And if you're not worried about liver flukes, you shouldn't have to be worried about the red water. If you are worried about liver flukes, then you probably want to use an 8-way instead of a 7-way vaccine. From a cost standpoint, you're typically looking at about 5 to 10 cents a dose, depending on what product line you're buying there. If you're unsure and you want to use the 8-way, it's not going to hurt anything, but it may or may not be needed depending on where you're at. And remember, from a liver fluke standpoint, we looked at that map last week. We typically think about those problems along the Gulf Coast, along the Red River, sometimes along the Trinity River, and then some other rivers. But we need an area in those pastures that hold water for a while, some standing water for those snails and liver flukes for that life cycle to happen there. If you have all ground that dries out without any problem, then liver flukes are likely not going to be an issue for you. When we think about the vaccines, and especially when we think about Vibrio and Lepto, you'll hear those two grouped together and talked about together. When you see L5 on a vaccine, that's referring to those 5 traditional strains of Lepto. When you see L5HB, we're dealing with those 5 traditional strains of Lepto and then the newer Harjo bovis strain of Lepto. And when I say newer, realize it's been out for in vaccines for probably a little over 20 years now, roughly, but it is the most recent Lepto component that's been added in. And Harjo bovis is cattle are the maintenance host for it, meaning it can thrive in cattle and reproduce, whereas some of the other strains maybe there's a wildlife species that's the maintenance host, but cattle can pick it up, and we may see some reproductive loss or some other issues if cattle pick it up. And then when we see VL5HB, so the L5 is the 5 traditional strains of Lepto, the HB is the Harjo bovis, and the V is going to be the Vibrio there in that situation. Another thing, when we look at vaccines, you really have to pay close attention because there can be some subtle differences. So I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, well, I gave them Virus Shield. I said, well, which one did you give? Because there's 11 different versions of Virus Shield on the market. And we'll see multiple versions of other products when we look at the Vista line of vaccines, or we look at the Bovishield line of vaccines, or maybe we look at Triangle. Realize most of these vaccine companies, and there's really only 4 major ones at this point in time in the U.S., is they'll have a product line, but they'll have different variations on that. So if you kind of look here, what you'll see with the Virus Shield 6 is the Virus Shield 6 is the 4 viral components. So the IBR, the BVD, the PI3, and the VRSV. You say, well, if you counted 4, Jason, why do they call it 6? Well, because especially when we look at BVD, there's a couple different strains, and if you're marketing something, does it sound better to call it a 4 or to call it a 6? Well, 6 sounds better. So what we've seen over the years is some people or some companies may either use 5 or 6 instead of just 4 to describe those 4 viral components because of some of the different strains we may see in there. The Virus Shield 6 plus L5 just has the Lepto added in. That next one there would have the Lepto and the Harjo bovis. Then you can see Vibrio and these next 2. And then all of these over here would be the same, except they have that Histophilus somnus in there. And we typically think about that from a respiratory standpoint. In some situations, it could potentially result in some reproductive issues as well. So that's why that particular company combines it in their combination product. And then this is a different version. That's a Virus Shield 4 versus Virus Shield 6. So make sure you really look at these letters after that name because, like I said, those companies will have multiple products within that particular line. So some other things we want to talk about from a vaccine terminology standpoint is you may have heard, well, this is a killed virus and this is a modified live virus. And that's important because depending on what modified live viruses is, we may have restrictions for how or when it can be used in breeding animals, when we think about a killed virus, and that's what you'll see used a lot of times, is we don't have the same level of restrictions with killed viruses. They may not give us quite as much immunity as modified live in certain situations, but we don't have some of those restrictions. Modified live, we may have restrictions on when we can use it, especially if we're talking about breeding stock. But if you're selling calves through a preconditioned calf sale, or you're retaining calves through the feedlot, then that's where we definitely want to think about that modified live viral vaccine, because it does work a little bit differently there. The two components of that we really have to think about and pay attention and really look at when we're vaccinating the cow herd is the IBR and the BVD portions, because remember, they can cause reproductive loss. The other thing I would tell you is sometimes you'll see that statement on some of these modified live products that says safe for pregnant cows, but then it has that asterisk. Make sure you read that asterisk, because that asterisk is going to say it's safe assuming you followed these certain requirements. And I'll expand on that here more in just a minute, but do make sure you read what that asterisk says. So generally speaking, if we're, like I said, we're going to be selling those stocker calves in that preconditioned calf sale, we're dealing with feeder cattle going to the feedlot, we typically think about modified live virus use in them after they're off the cow. You can potentially give a modified live to that calf once nursing the cow, but make sure you visit with your veterinarian before you do that, and make sure we're following label directions, because there were some issues in the past with some other versions of vaccines where we gave that modified live to the calf, and that potentially there was some concern about it causing some abortions in the cows. Varying opinions on that, but do make sure you visit with your veterinarian or a company rep about those products. If you're unsure, just realize you're always going to be safe using the killed product on the cow and using a killed product on that calf once nursing the cow. Now, when it comes to the modified live, especially when we look at the IBR and the BVD for use in breeding females, I'm going to tell you that opinions in the industry vary out there, both within the academic community and within the pharmaceutical company community. There does appear to be a growing amount of concern about using modified live, IBR, and BVD in our cow herd, even if we're using it on label directions. There's some research, there's a study out of South Dakota specifically that would show at least some numerical reductions in those products as far as pregnancy rates with comparing killed to saline versus modified live. I'm going to tell you, there's some people out there that have some issues with the way that study was written up. I don't have any issues with the raw data, so I do go ahead and mention it. And I won't get into all the details about that, but there are, just to be fair, there are some folks who do have some concerns about that particular paper. The other thing we really need to think about is what's your level of risk. If you're really moving a lot of cattle in and out, your level of risk is higher, and you definitely may want to, for sure, make sure you're getting modified live in those replacement heifers at a very young age, and then maybe continued with a killed after that, or maybe even a modified live after that, if it's labeled for that and you've used it according to label directions and you visited with your veterinarian. If your risk level is really low and you're unsure and you just want to be safe, then the killed option may be the route you want to go. I'll just tell you personally, and this is just me and our family operation, for years we used a modified live product in the cow herd according to label directions. Here within the last couple years, because of some of the new research that has come on the market and some of those concerns, I have personally switched to just a killed product in the cow herd and on the calves while they're nursing. After we wean those calves and we have them by themselves, they will get a modified live at that point in time so they can qualify for the preconditioned calf sale that we market in typically. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts. I know everybody wants to see some real world examples. So we'll kind of go through those, especially since we're only dealing with 4 companies. It makes it a little simpler to kind of talk about some basic examples that would match those diseases that are routinely vaccinated for in that slide I showed you earlier. Remember, these are just basic examples to illustrate a vaccine program, and make sure you always consult with a cattle veterinarian in case you need to customize it for your operation or for the area you're in. So if we look at Elanco, the product that would get the IVR, the BVD, the PI3, and the BRSV is VirusShield 6, and then to get the 2 different groups of lepto, so the 5 traditional strains of lepto, that L5 and the Harjo bovis, that product would be VirusShield 6 plus L5HB. Some people would use the VL5HB if they were worried about Vibrio. Elanco does not offer a Clostridial vaccine at this point in time, so you would just look at using a Clostridial vaccine from one of the other companies if you were using the VirusShield 6 plus L5HB, and that would be the Elanco product line. Another company out there, you'll hear us refer to them as BI, Boehringer Ingelheim is their name. It's a whole lot easier to say BI. Their Clostridial product, and they have a couple different ones. The one I used in the example here is their Alpha line of Clostridial vaccines, particularly Alpha 7 here. And this is a good illustration of why it's important to always read labels, because this Alpha line of Clostridial vaccines is a little different than most. So when we think about killed products that we're using in an animal that's never been vaccinated before, we would give 1 dose, and then within a period of time later, we'd give a 2nd dose. And what happens is that first dose kind of primes the immune system that says, hey, wake up, you need to start building an immune response to this antigen here. And then when we give that 2nd dose, then the immune system builds an even stronger response. So we get a little response with the first dose, a bigger response with that 2nd dose. And then typically with those killed products, we're going to give once a year after that. Whereas the modified live products, we only really have to give those once initially to get that immunity. Now, what's unique about the Alpha 7 or the Alpha line of Clostridial vaccines from BI is you only have to give that once, even though it's a killed product initially. The other thing I would tell you about that product is it does put a little bigger knot on them. Doesn't hurt anything, just something you want to be aware of, I want to mention, so you're not surprised by if you do see a little bit bigger knot. So instead of that golf ball size knot that we're used to seeing with some of the vaccines, the Alpha 7 will put one on them about the size of a tennis ball. Doesn't hurt anything, but we will see a little bigger knot there. And then when we think about the viral respiratory component, and we think about our lepto and our Harjo bovis, that product then would be Triangle 10 HB. And both this Triangle 10 HB and the VirusShield I talked about on the previous slide are all killed products, so we don't have some of those restrictions in the cow herd that we will have for some of our modified lives. So those are 2 of the companies. These next 2 companies, we're going to talk about products because they don't have a completely killed product, or maybe they don't have a killed product at all. We're going to talk about products that have a modified live virus component for that IVR, BVD, PI3, and BRSV potentially. So again, we're going to see some label restrictions here, so make sure you do adhere to those label restrictions. So Merck is one of those companies. Their Clostridial vaccine, they have a couple of them that have tetanus in there if you want the tetanus, but kind of one of the basic ones we think about is their Vision 7 product. And then on the respiratory side for the IVR, BVD, PI3, and BRSV, that's going to be Vista 5, L5. So the 5 is, again, those 4 components we talked about, but some of the additional strains. The L5 is their lepto. Very, very important here. Make sure you realize with this Vista line of products, it's only labeled for use prior to breeding. So it is not labeled for use in a pregnant animal. And I would tell you, prior to breeding, the longer we can be away from breeding, probably the better off we're going to be. We'd be better off at 60 days before breeding than we would 30. And there's some new information that would show maybe if we're even further out than that, that's going to be beneficial. Question was, will the knot go away? And so whether it's the Vision 7 and it's going to put a knot on them, the Alpha 7 that's going to put a knot on them, and then sometimes we'll see some of the other killed products, those knots will go away, but it's a pretty long time. So if we think about those calves, a lot of times those calves, when we go to sell them, are still going to have those knots on them. Doesn't hurt them a bit. Sometimes you'll hear some people try to say, well, I don't want to pay as much for that calf because it has a knot on them. Well, in reality, they know that calf has been vaccinated for something, so they're willing to pay for those calves. It's just everybody's always looking, depending on what side of the equation you're on, you want to try to sell them for as much as you can, and somebody else is trying to maybe buy them a little cheaper. So if somebody tells you that, just argue with them. You shouldn't have to have that argument very long. But those knots will be there for a while, but over time, they will go away. Hopefully that answers that question that came in. Zoetis is going to be the 4th company, and we're actually going to have to use 3 products here to accomplish vaccinating for those basic pathogens we talked about. So Clostridial, they have both Ultra Choice and Ultra Bac. I happen to use the Ultra Bac 7 in here, so that's that 7-way Clostridial vaccine. When we look at Lepto, their product's going to be Spirovac L5. So instead of using the HB terminology, if you see Spirovac, that stands for Harjo bovis. So Spirovac L5 would be Harjo bovis plus those 5 traditional strains of Lepto. And then the Cattle Master Gold FP5 is for the respiratory components. And this is a combination product. It has the IBR and PI3 are actually what they call modified live temperature sensitive, meaning that they will only grow at certain temperatures in the body. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as a chemically altered, but they'll also use the term modified live temperature sensitive for the IBR and PI3 fractions. It has a killed BVD component, so that's safe. We don't have any restrictions there. And then a modified live BRSV. So you have a temperature sensitive modified live, a true modified live, and a killed, all in that component. So those would be examples from the 4 companies out there. Now, when we think about a vaccine program, can one program fit everyone? No, we have those components that are going to be a base for all programs, but maybe there's a certain issue you're having that you may need to add something in. That's not extremely common, but we do see it from time to time. Or if you're selling calves in a particular manner, then there may be some additional vaccines that have to be added to be eligible for those special sales. When we think about timing of vaccine, I'm going to give you kind of the real world approach. So we have the ideal scenario of everything's perfect. This was what we would do, but in reality, this may be what a lot of folks end up doing. So when we think about calves, we typically want to get that initial round of vaccine in those calves when they're 2 to 3 months of age. So again, that's going to be that Clostridial vaccine, the IBR, BVD, PI3, and BRSV, the viral respiratory components, and then the lepto there. Now, I'll typically tell you, if you read the label, the ideal situation, if you can come back in 4 to 6 weeks and booster that killed product, that's the ideal scenario. I'll tell you, in reality, what happens a lot of times with that booster vaccine is it gets done a couple weeks pre-weaning, or we may wean those calves and then do it a week or 2 post-weaning. Most producers tend to get along pretty good with that, but that's kind of the practical versus the perfect scenario there. I would tell you, if you can keep from vaccinating on weaning day, I think that's a benefit, because we do know when we wean those calves, we're going to have some stress there. With that stress, that can suppress that immune response. So if you can do it a little pre-weaning or a little post-weaning, personally, I like that better. If it makes sense and you really need to do it on weaning, that's okay. I'd much rather you do it on the day of weaning than not doing it at all. But that's kind of what we would think about for our calves. And then that would be for our killed products. And if you were going into a preconditioned calf cell, you needed a modified live. Most people would look at giving that modified live post-weaning. When we think about the cow herd, pre-calving that Clostridial vaccine, that may be the ideal time for it, because remember, we're thinking about trying to increase the level of antibodies in that cow so she passes more to her calf in the colostrum. In reality, from a handling and a timing standpoint, we're probably going to give the Clostridial vaccines and all these at the other time. I'll tell you, the pre-breeding may be a little bit more critical than the timing on the Clostridial. So pre-breeding preferred would be IBR, BVD, the Lepto, and then if you were given Vibrio, the Vibrio. In reality, because of logistics involved with handling cattle, what ends up happening in most operations is we just go ahead and give all those vaccines to the cows when we bring them in to palpate or when we bring them in to handle. So again, that's kind of perfect scenario versus here's what's feasible in most operations. So when we think about vaccines, it's important to realize that not all animals are going to respond to vaccine. In good situations where we don't have big parasite loads, when we're on a good nutrition program, we're expecting to see 80 to 95% response on those animals. In stressed animals, we could definitely see less than 60% on those animals. So that's why sometimes I tell you the modified live, technically we only have to give it once, but a lot of times we'll give it a second time to try to make sure we pick up any of those animals who didn't respond the first time, and really thinking about calves there. In the cow herd, most of those vaccines are just going to be once a year, but those in the calves or when we're going into the feedlot or when those animals get to the feedlot, we may use that modified live twice in that situation. The other thing we want to realize is not all vaccines protect against that animal getting disease. And one of them that's really important, so you don't get a false sense of security there, is the trick vaccine. So there is a vaccine for trick, but it doesn't prevent that animal from getting trick. All it does is decreases the recovery time. So what we really want to do is make sure we never get trick in that cow, because if we get trick, we're going to see high abortion rates. And then hopefully if we give that cow long enough, most of those cows will clear after several months. We may potentially have some that don't ever clear. And then bulls, when they get the infection, they have the infection. Here's another one where timing gets even more important. So those other ones I told you, we kind of have some flexibility in the real world. Tell you a little situation had several years ago with the producer. Unfortunately, they had a situation where some bulls got across the fence, brought trick into the herd. So they were using the trick vaccine to help try to speed recovery in their cow herd. And when we talk about the trick vaccine, primary vaccine, like with most killed products, we're going to need to do 2 doses. It's real critical here that we give that first dose and then we give that second dose 2 to 4 weeks later. But the most important part is that we get that last dose in those animals at least 4 weeks before breeding. Because remember, trick spread through breeding activity. Unfortunately, in that situation that I was working with that producer on, or actually was working with them on something else and found out about the trick situation, the trick vaccine, the second dose was given halfway through the breeding season. So we really didn't get the full benefit of the vaccine there. So On some of these, timing can be very, very important. Trick is a perfect example of that. Another thing, when we think about our vaccine programs, it's really important that we evaluate those on a yearly basis. The reason being is that as we have new research come on the market. So as I mentioned, on the reproductive side with some of the modified live virus vaccines, we have seen some new research come on the market here the last few years there. We may have changes in what vaccines are available. So this is something that has from time to time. You may have the product in mind that you want to use, but you call and you find out it's out of stock or it's on back order. So we may have to make an adjustment there. Maybe there's something in your operation that's changed from a risk standpoint, and so we may need to adjust our program if there's any label changes on those vaccines or if there's any new products that have come online. And again, it's highly beneficial if you can visit with a cattle veterinarian to make sure you have the best plan in place for your operation. Another question that comes up from time to time is, can we give too many vaccines at once? And definitely we can. What we're worried about is endotoxin loading at that point in time. I'll tell you, the examples I showed you and the diseases that we think about in that basic program were okay there when we're dealing with beef cattle. But if we started to add in a pink eye vaccine or maybe salmonella or E. coli vaccine or something else, we could get in a situation where we may be giving more than what we would want in that situation. So we would want to space those out. So like I said, the examples I gave you, generally most people would consider those to be fine. But if we add something, we would want to evaluate that from an endotoxin standpoint. The other thing is dairy cattle are more sensitive than beef cattle. So some of the combination products and the number of products we may give at once in beef cattle, we may not want to do that in dairy cattle. So if you do have some dairy cattle, just be aware of that. Or if you bought some Holstein steers or something like that to graze, be aware of that. Some other considerations we want to think about from a vaccine standpoint is, what is the level of claim on that vaccine? And this is one, especially when we look at Harjo bovis here in recent years, there's some, not all the vaccines are given the same label claims, so you do want to be aware of that. And so those claims, they can list either prevention of infection, prevention of disease, aid in disease control, or aid in disease prevention, excuse me, and then aid in disease control, and then some other claims. If you can get it, prevention of infections is going to be the first one at the top of the list on choice, and then go down from there. So if you're comparing products, that's something to be aware of and pay attention to. When we think about Lepto bovis, there's a couple products that actually have the Harjo bovis antigen in there that you're vaccinating against. So they're going to have a little higher level of claim. And then there's some other products that, because of a different type of Harjo bovis, it's not actually, or a different type of Harjo, excuse me, that's not actually Harjo bovis, there's kind of a cross protection claim, so a different level of claim. So do be aware of that, especially if you're worried about Lepto bovis in your operation. And that's the top bullet there that I just mentioned. The other thing is, we all like to be cost conscious. I'm definitely in that situation, but cost shouldn't always be your only focus. Look for the vaccines that are going to meet your needs the best from a timing standpoint, and then the diseases you're worried about. And then if you've worked with your veterinarian and you've come up with a good program, be careful about deviating with other products. And situation here, for those of you who know Dr. Haregrove, an extension veterinarian that I work with, when he was in private practice, he had worked with an operation and laid out the program he wanted them to use. But when they went to purchase those vaccines, well, the specific one that he wanted was out of stock. So they substituted another one that had this fraction but had some other ones in there. And they had to do that a couple times. And when he looked at it, they were actually given 3 different vaccines that all had lepto in it. Okay, so make sure we don't want to over We don't want to be using multiple products that all have the same or similar antigens in there for those diseases. So if you do variate because something is out of stock, make sure you pay attention with that, or follow back up with your veterinarian or whoever helped you design your vaccination program. Want to wrap up here a little bit talking about vaccine storage, and then we'll talk about needle and syringe selection just real quickly. But when we think about storage, a lot of times most of us are storing vaccine in those refrigerators out in the garage or barn. And if we think about where that refrigerator likely came from, it was the old refrigerator out of the house, or even if it was a new refrigerator, most refrigerators just aren't designed to handle the heat that we can have, especially in our Texas summers. This happens to be a study that was done out of the University of Arkansas, Dr. Tom Troxell and some colleagues there. They went in and they identified 239 refrigerators, and they put temperature recording devices in those refrigerators that took temperature every 10 minutes for 48 hours. And they used refrigerators that were in retail stores and co-ops, represented 18% of the refrigerators they used, 75% were on farms and ranches, 77% were in vet clinics. What they found, unfortunately, is the majority of the time those refrigerators weren't keeping that vaccine in that ideal window that we talk about from 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. 14% of the readings were above 45. 33% were below 35. We only had 54% of the readings in that time window. I'll tell you, similar studies have been done at other universities, and we always see the same situation. I'll just tell you personally, after seeing the first study that came out on this, I moved that vaccine from the refrigerator in the garage to the refrigerator in the house. So be aware of those things. Make sure we store them properly. That vaccine freezing can be just as bad as that vaccine getting too warm. So we do want to keep it at the right temperature. Some producers have actually gone to buying inexpensive weather stations that will record minimum and maximum temperature, and putting those in their refrigerators just to help keep track of that, especially if they have a lot of vaccine that they're storing in there. Make sure you pay attention to those bottles. So this is a picture from that study. There were 31 bottles. All of them were open. 27 of them were expired. So do make sure you're paying attention and get those products used in a timely manner so that we're not wasting money there. If you wanted to read more, this is just the paper that talks about that temperature study on those vaccines in more detail. Some other things when we think about handling vaccines, make sure we purchase those vaccines from sources that understand the importance of proper handling. Like I mentioned, we want to store them between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure we avoid direct sunlight. So if you go locally to buy them, make sure you take an ice chest and some cool packs with you for the ride home. If you're ordering them and having them shipped, make sure they're cool when they arrive. If not, call the company and get those sent back. It's critical that we keep those in that correct temperature. Chute side, we want to keep them in a vaccine, and also we want to protect our syringes from temperature and sunlight. These are some homemade options here. Styrofoam cooler with some holes drilled in it so we can slide some repeating syringes in. Bucket with a lid, same thing. But both of those, we want to drop some cold packs in there as well. I'll tell you, I like a version of the bucket with the lid. I'll actually use a regular ice chest with the lid and drill holes through it and drop cold packs in the bottom of it. Personally for me, because we have enough distance between the cold pack and the needle that's on that syringe, I typically won't recap those needles in between each animal if I can drop it down in there and I don't have to worry about it touching or hitting anything there. Just simplifies things a little bit. There's also a lot of options out there that you can purchase ranging in price. I'll tell you, make sure you look at these closely. I was at a trade show a couple of years ago in Fort Worth and looking at one, and where the syringes were to be stored, there wasn't any room for cold packs. So I asked the rep, I said, how am I supposed to keep this vaccine cool? And they kind of looked at me with a puzzled look. We said, what do you mean trying to keep it cool? They were from a very cold climate, so they were actually worried about that vaccine freezing on them versus getting too hot. So do pay attention to that if that cooler was built for a specific environment before you spend a tremendous amount of money on it. The other thing is some vaccines we do have to mix. Typically, we think about this with our modified live virus products, but you'll see an example of a killed product on the next slide that we have to mix. When we do have to mix, we'll typically have a glass bottle with a freeze-dried portion in it, and then we'll have a plastic bottle with a liquid portion in it. The easiest way to mix those is with a transfer needle. We're going to put that in the plastic bottle, flip it over, put it in the glass bottle. That glass bottle is going to have a vacuum. It'll suck the liquid in. You can kind of squeeze that plastic bottle just slightly to help it when you're doing that. And then take and just gently mix that vaccine up. Don't shake the living daylights out of it. You can actually rupture some of the cells in that vaccine. The other thing is we want to make sure we use up that vaccine within 30 minutes to an hour. Now, I will warn some of you, there's a couple of companies in the last several years that their glass bottle isn't big enough to hold all the liquid fraction. So you have to move some of the liquid fraction over, take a syringe, pull it back across, and then finish mixing it. So just be aware of that if you do run into that situation. I told you most of the time it's the modified live viral products that we have to mix, but there are some Mannheimia hemolytic products which are actually killed bacterial products that we have to mix. An example of that is the one-shot product from Zoetis. When we think about needles and syringes, for given injections, I really prefer either a 16 or an 18 gauge needle. That's talking about how big of a round that needle is. For vaccines, either one of them are fine. If you're given an antibiotic that may be thick, like oxytetracycline or penicillin, then a 16 gauge needle works much better. In my mind, a 20 gauge needle is just too thin to really be ideal for giving vaccines. We increase the risk of that needle bending or breaking on us. So for vaccines, I really like either a 16 or an 18 gauge needle there. The other thing we want to think about is length of that needle. And so the four most common sizes we'll see, this isn't all of them, but these are the four most common, is a 5/8, a 3/4, an inch, and an inch and a half. And for sub-Q injections, the shorter the better. So that 5/8 and that 3/4 work much better for giving sub-Q injections in those longer needles. When you're given intramuscular injections, most of our vaccines now are labeled for sub-Q, and we want to go sub-Q if that option is there. But if we do have to go intramuscular, an inch is plenty big, even on big bulls or big cows. I just really don't see a lot of benefit to an 1.5 inch needle when we're giving injections, and there are some definite disadvantages. It makes that needle much more likely to bend or break. So I really like a 5/8 for sub-Q, and then an inch is plenty for those intramuscular injections. When we look at syringes for vaccines, there's a couple different options. So top left up here, we could look at a plastic syringe. Now, even though this is a 60 cc syringe, and if you were using 5 cc vaccine dose, you could put 12 cc's in there. We don't want to because you can't accurately give it. So on those plastic syringes, get a smaller one, and you really just want to put a single dose in there. And then we're going to throw these away when we get done with them. It's not worth the effort to try to clean those. What, if you're not using, you may consider, and there's some expense involved, but I think you'll find it's definitely worth it, is what we would call a multiple dose or repeating syringe. This is one example. There's some other ones out there as well, but they're designed where you can set it to give an exact dose, and every time you squeeze that handle, it gives the same dose every time. So you could put multiple doses in there, but still be assured you're given the right dose every time you use it. Most of these will come on these barrel type like this, will come in either a 25 or a 50 cc barrel. If you're given a 2 cc vaccine, I want that 25 cc barrel. That syringe will generally adjust from half cc to 2.5 cc's in half cc increments. So you set it on 2, you can put basically 12 doses in there. Every time you squeeze it, you get the exact 2 cc's you want. You could do that with the 50 cc barrel. The problem is that squeeze is much shorter. And so you sometimes are wondering on a 2 cc, did you actually give that full dose? So 2 cc, I like the 25 cc barrel. For a 5 cc dose, I like that 50 cc barrel. Question was, how often should you change needles? Anytime that needle bends or gets dull, absolutely change it. Or if you drop it and gets dirty, change it. If not, the rule of thumb in most operations is going to be roughly every 10 head, or when you're using a multi-dose syringe, anytime you need to go back in that bottle and refill it, I would change the needle. So that typically works out to be every 10 to 12 animals. As far as needle gauge goes, just a reminder, that question came in on a vaccine. Either a 16 or an 18 gauge needle is going to work really well. I'll get to the question on cleaning here in just a second. Here's another option for a multiple dose syringe. You can see it has a really small barrel. It's adjustable as well, but it's designed for you to put the bottle of vaccine on it. Some people like these, others find them a little more cumbersome to use. And also you got to think about keeping that bottle cool. So you're probably setting it back in the ice chest between each animal. So kind of a personal preference. I personally like the barrel style a little bit better. And then when it comes to giving vaccines, we don't want to use these syringes that have the tubes on them. That's great for dewormers or if we were using something else. But we don't like that for vaccine because there's several doses in there and we can't protect those from sunlight and temperature. So the ones with the tube have some really good uses. Vaccines just aren't one of them. The other thing is make sure we label those syringes so we don't get them mixed up. Everybody can kind of tell the difference between these two, but once we empty them, which one had the pink product and which one had the yellowish product. On the plastic syringes, it works well to take a Sharpie and just put a colored line along the plunger here, or you could put a little piece of colored tape and then put that same color on the bottle you're using. On repeating syringes, you can do the same thing, or I actually just write on the handle. I'll write blackleg, or I'll write Vibrio and Lepto, or I may write modified live, just whatever to let you know what that syringe is being used for. Question came up on these multi-dose syringes or repeating syringes. How do you go about cleaning those? We never ever want to use any kind of disinfectants, no Novosan, no chlorhexidine, no soap, no bleach, none of those things, because we can leave some residue in there, even if it's just a very little bit, that can reduce the efficacy of the vaccine or potentially completely inactivate it. What I want to do is use boiling water. Some people will break them apart and actually boil them. What I personally do is go to the store, don't use the one out of whoever does the cooking in your house's cabinet, and get you a glass measuring cup. That'll measure 2 cups or so. It works even better if you have one with a handle on it. You can use a glass canning jar. I like the measuring cup a little bit better because it has the handle on it. Get that home, rinse it with water several times, just water out of the tap. After that, then what we're going to do is get a gallon jug of distilled water, fill that up with distilled water, either drop your transfer needle in there if you're comfortable doing that, or if you're not comfortable having that metal transfer needle in the microwave, put you a toothpick in there, put it in the microwave 5 to 6 minutes, whatever it takes until that water's boiling. And then I'll bring that out. I'll take my repeating syringe. I'll fill it up with that distilled boiling water and flush it out. and I'll do that 6 to 10 times. And that's the way I'm going to clean them. Now, what I will do before that is just run them under the tap water for any dirt that may be on the outside. But I'm just going to flush that boiling distilled water through it 6 to 10 times. Now, you may be wondering, why did I put that toothpick in there, or why did I mention putting that transfer needle in there? You got to be careful about superheating water in a microwave so you can actually get it hotter than boiling without it actually bubbling. If it's not bubbling, then when you grab it and break the surface tension, it can potentially explode on you. As long as it's bubbling, you don't have to worry about that by dropping that toothpick in there, or if you're comfortable, I put my metal transfer needle in that water and put it in the microwave all the time. Just do what you're comfortable with. That breaks that surface tension. You don't have to worry about that exploding. But that's the way I found that works best for me. That's what we do. That measuring cup then, that's the only thing it ever gets used for, is cleaning those syringes. And then what I like doing is I'll get me a little plastic container that will hold my glass measuring cup, that'll hold my syringes, and I'll take, and after I get done rinsing them out, I'll put them in there, let them cool to room temperature, and then I'll just take all that and put in the freezer until I get ready to use those syringes again. That way I don't have to worry about letting them dry completely before I put them up in the cabinet. The other benefit to that can be is having that little bit of steam left in there from that distilled water will kind of help keep that O-ring on that syringe lubricated. And then with that, just as a quick reminder, when we give those injections, if we're giving IM, it needs to be in the neck. If we're giving sub-Q, it can be neck or elbow pocket. Make sure you're using a tented technique where you pull that skin out and actually get that sub-Q in there. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions anybody has. So a question came in, does Covexin 8 and Triangle 5 cover the need for East Texas? So the Covexin 8 is one of the Clostridial products with tetanus in there. So that Covexin 8 would cover all of our Clostridial plus tetanus. The Triangle 5 is only going to get our viral components, the IVR and the BVD, the PI3 and the VRSV. So I would want to look at maybe a product like the Triangle 10 so I can get my lepto in there as well. And then if you needed Vibrio, you would want to add that. So that would be a good base, but I would definitely want lepto in there. So the question came in, do I use the same length and gauge of needle for both cows and calves? Generally, yes, I will. So on vaccines, this is just kind of my personal preference. If it's a 2 cc vaccine, especially on calves, I'll use an 18 gauge needle. On the cows, I'll use that 18 gauge needle as well. If it is a 5 cc vaccine, just from making it easier to fill that syringe up, a lot of times I'll use a 16 gauge needle at that point in time, but either one of them works fine. And if you want to keep things simple so you don't have to have different sizes and gauges of needles around, just getting a 16 gauge 5/8 needle and then just a few 16 gauge 1-inch needles, that'll cover all your needs. But if I can use that 18 gauge needle on calves, it's a little easier, but I use both of them, just personal preference. With that, I don't see any additional questions coming in. So I think we'll go ahead and end the program tonight. And again, just thank everybody for attending and hope to see you in the upcoming weeks.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Shaniqua.